The Great London Smog. All right, picture this. You wake up one morning in London, ready to go about your day, maybe grab a cup of tea, complain about the weather, and pretend you like standing in long queues. But when you step outside, you can't see a thing. The air is thick, yellowish, and smells like a bonfire at a garbage dump. Your lungs are burning, your eyes are stinging, and you honestly can't even breathe properly. Yeah, doesn't sound great at all, does it? Well, this was exactly what happened in London in 1952. So you see, London in the 1950s had a long, toxic love affair with coal. And I mean coal-powered everything. People even burned low-quality coal in their fireplaces, filling the air with smoke, and, well, London was already famous for its fog, but this wasn't that cute, misty Sherlock Holmes kind of fog. This was soot, smoke, and industrial filth marinating in the air like a bad stew. Then on December 5th, 1952, London's air decided to go full serial killer. The cold during this time was so extreme that people burned more coal than normal, and this was the final push that set everything in motion. Even the wind that would normally try to blow the pollution away was literally overpowered, and soon there was a temperature inversion, which basically means that a layer of warm air had trapped all the smoke and pollution close to the ground. Imagine putting a lid on a boiling pot, except the pot is London and the steam is literal poison. Within hours, the city was unrecognizable. People couldn't see their own feet. Cars crashed into each other, theaters canceled performances because the audience couldn't see the stage, and even buses had to be led by people walking in front with flashlights. And then people started dying. At first, it was the usual suspects: elderly people with breathing problems, babies and children whose lungs couldn't take it, and people with asthma, which in 1952 basically meant good luck, buddy. But then, even healthy people started collapsing in the streets. The smog was so thick and toxic, people were literally suffocating while walking outside. Imagine what drowning feels like, but on land. That's what this was. The worst part? London had no idea how bad it really was. For the first couple of days, people just thought the fog was annoying, but by the time day 3 rolled around, they were dropping dead faster than that character in a horror movie who says, "I'll be right back." Hospitals were overflowing as doctors were pulling soot out of people's lungs like it was some kind of horrifying black tar magic trick. Yet the British government's response was, "It's just a bit of fog, mate." No evacuations, no emergency response, no warnings, just British stoicism at its most dangerous. The smog lasted for 5 days. 5! Finally clearing up on December 9th when the wind finally decided to do its job, but by then, at least 4,000 people were already dead. But wait, it gets worse. Over the next few weeks, another 8,000 people died from complications caused by the smog. That's 12,000 deaths from the air. However, as sad and scary as this story is, something positive came out of it because it forced the government to pass the Clean Air Act in 1956, banning dirty coal and forcing cities to clean up their act. In other words, this one disaster forced governments to finally acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, poisoning the air isn't a great idea. The strange disappearance. It's Christmas Eve in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and the Sauter family, a big Italian-American crew of 12 people because they had 10 kids, were prepping for Christmas joy and a whole lot of noise the next morning. The presents were under the tree, the mom was making snacks, and the kids were begging to stay up late because it was Christmas. What could go wrong? Well, in this case, everything. At around midnight, the parents, George and Jenny Sauter, went to bed, and 5 of their kids, aged 5 to 14, stayed up playing with their new toys. Then, at 1 a.m., the phone rings. Jenny answers, expecting maybe a relative. Instead, she hears a weird lady giggling and then asks for someone who doesn't live there before hanging up abruptly. Definitely weird, but nothing crazy, so of course, Jenny went back to sleep. About half an hour later, Jenny woke up again, but this time to the sound of something hitting the roof. She doesn't hear anything else, so she goes back to sleep. But then, around 1:30 a.m., she smells smoke. And just like that, the house is on fire. Cue the chaos. The father, George Sauter, literally turns into a full-on action hero and manages to get his wife and 4 of their children out, but the 5 kids who were awake were still inside. So George, being a dad and therefore automatically a firefighter when needed, tries to rescue them. He goes to grab his ladder to climb into their window, but the ladder is nowhere to be found. He tries to start his truck to drive closer to the house and climb up, but both trucks won't start, even though they worked fine that day. The man even tries to get water from the rain barrels, but the water is frozen solid. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. By the time firefighters showed up at dawn, because apparently emergency was optional in 1945, the house was completely reduced to ash. The most shocking part is that there was no single remains of the 5 Sauter kids that were left in the house. Not a single bone or tooth. Nothing. They were just gone. I mean, even in cremation, which is like thousands of degrees hotter than a house fire, bones still remain. Now, the story gets even weirder because apparently George told the police that a few months before the fire, a random insurance salesman came to the Sauter house and said, "Your house is going to go up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed." Now, fast forward almost 10 years after the fire, and a photo was mailed to the Sauter family of a man who looked just like their missing son, Louis. Sadly, the children were never found, but Jenny never stopped searching, and up until she died in 1989, she kept a giant billboard up with their pictures, begging for answers. On a side note, I don't want to beg you for it, but it'd be so nice if you subscribe. Thanks. Mwah. Deadly flight. Never say never until you've been put in this same situation, because I'm definitely sure the guys who survived didn't think they'd ever have to eat human flesh. That's exactly what happened when a Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH-227 plane took off from Montevideo, Uruguay, carrying 45 people, including the old Christians Club rugby team and some of their friends and family, on October 13th, 1972. These guys were headed to Santiago, Chile for a rugby match, but as they flew over the Andes Mountains, the pilots made a massive mistake. They thought they had cleared the mountains and started descending too early. And just like that, the plane slammed into a mountain. The wings snapped off like cheap plastic toys, and passengers were thrown like rag dolls. Some people died instantly, others were left injured, confused, and freezing in the middle of nowhere. The worst part is they crashed in the middle of nowhere. The landing spot was at 11,800 feet, approximately 3,600 meters above sea level, and the temperatures dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius or negative 22 Fahrenheit at night. They were literally stuck on a frozen mountain in a broken plane in the middle of a blizzard with zero food. So what do you do when you're stranded in the Andes? Well, you panic. And then you try not to die. For the first few days, the survivors held on to hope. I mean, surely someone was going to find them soon. That didn't happen. So they started to search the wreckage for anything edible and found a few chocolate bars, some wine, and a little bit of food from people's bags. After a few days of living like that, they heard on a tiny radio that the search had been called off, so no one was coming to save them. And this was when things went from bad to nightmarish. The hunger was the main event they had, because if you're starving in sub-zero temperatures, your body starts eating itself, literally. So the survivors had to make the most horrifying decision imaginable: eat the frozen bodies of their dead friends or die themselves. Let that sink in. It was a gut-wrenching choice. Pun 100% intended. Many obviously struggled with the idea, but starvation doesn't care about your morals, so eventually they did what they had to. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Just when you thought things couldn't get worse, Mother Nature basically said, "Hold my beer." Because on day 17, an avalanche buried what was left of the fuselage, trapping some of the survivors under the snow for days. 8 more people died instantly, so at this point, only 19 were left alive. They were exhausted, starving, freezing, and hopeless, and yet somehow they still refused to give up. By December, 2 months after the crash, The survivors knew they had to save themselves, so two of them, Nando Parado and Roberto Canesa, decided to hike out of the mountains with no map, no climbing gear to find help. Mind you, these guys were weak from 2 months of near starvation, but still, they walked for 10 days through the Andes until they finally found a Chilean shepherd who immediately alerted authorities. On December 22nd, 1972, after 72 days in hell, the 16 remaining survivors were finally rescued. The Hinterkaifeck murders. The year is 1922, and we're in Hinterkaifeck, Germany, a tiny isolated farm in the middle of nowhere about 43 miles from Munich. On this farm lived the Gruber family, consisting of Andreas Gruber, a grumpy 63-year-old man who could probably go down as Germany's worst grandpa. Then there was Cecilia Gruber, his wife, who was tired of his nonsense, their 35-year-old daughter Victoria Gabriel, who was a widow with 2 kids, Victoria's children, 7-year-old Cecilia Jr. and a 2-year-old. And then finally, the maid, Maria Baumgartner, who was 44 years old. All caught up? Okay. So now, before the atrocity that even happened, you have to first understand the events that led up to the horrible night. Apparently, there had been a lot of creepy things happening in the house, and even the previous maid quit 6 months earlier because she thought the house was haunted. She heard footsteps in the attic, doors opening and closing on their own, and straight up said, "Nope, I'm out," and quit. Then one time, Andreas Gruber noticed weird footprints in the snow leading to his house, but not away. And even though he searched the property thoroughly, he still found nothing. And for the icing on this horror cake, someone stole their house keys. I repeat, someone took the keys to their farmhouse. After that, they kept finding weird stuff that wasn't theirs, like an unknown newspaper and strange tools indicating that someone was on their property. But instead of fleeing like any rational people would do, Andreas just shrugged it off like it was no big deal. So on the evening of March 31st, 1922, the entire family was brutally murdered. One by one, each victim was lured into the barn where they were bludgeoned to death with a pickaxe. First, Andreas and Cecilia Sr., then Victoria and little Cecilia Jr., then the killer went inside the house and killed baby Josef in his crib, and the new maid Maria, who had been there for less than a day. Poor woman started her first day on the job and got murdered that night. But here's the scariest part. The killer didn't just kill them and leave, they stayed for days. The killer slept in their beds, ate their food, and even fed the freaking animals. According to the investigation, whoever it was stayed there for 3 whole days after brutally killing 6 people. Eventually, on April 4th, 1922, neighbors finally got suspicious and worried because the family weren't showing up anywhere. And when they went into the barn, they found the bodies stacked on top of each other, covered in hay. The maid and baby Josef were found inside the house, murdered in their beds. It was a bloodbath. The police came, but by then, the entire crime scene had been contaminated by locals who trampled all over it like it was an open house. They even moved the bodies. Basically, if you wanted to solve the case, this is the worst way to do it. So despite over 100 suspects being questioned over the years, no one was ever arrested. The Dyatlov Pass incident. It's January 1959, deep in the icy wilderness of the Soviet Union, because apparently hiking in freezing, unforgiving mountains is someone's idea of fun. A group of 9 expert hikers, mostly students from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, decided to take on a grueling trek through the Ural Mountain. Why? Because why not freeze to death for fun? And leading the expedition was Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old hiking enthusiast who had no idea he was about to become a legend in the creepiest way possible. Now, as part of the group, we had Igor Dyatlov, Yuri Doroshenko, Ludmila Dubinina, Georgy Krivonishenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Rustem Slobodin, Zinieda Kolmogorova, Nikolai Thibault Brignoles, and finally, Semyon Zolotaryov. Yeah, those were some really stressful names to try and pronounce, but honestly, after what they went through, it's the least we can do. Fun fact, there were originally supposed to be 10 in number, but one guy, Yuri Yudin, dropped out early due to illness. That was probably the best decision of his life. Let me tell you why. So basically, these 9 hikers had a goal to reach Mount Atorten, a place whose name literally translates to "Don't don't go there. But yeah, they started the journey and even documented their entire trip with diaries and cameras, showing them laughing, skiing, and having a great time. However, on February 1st, everything changed when they set up camp on the slopes of Kolotsiekl, which means Dead Mountain. And that night, something happened. Something terrifying enough to send 9 experienced hikers running for their lives, half-dressed, into a deadly blizzard. And this is where the real horror begins. Until today, nobody lived to tell the story. In fact, how people even realized that something horrible had happened to them? Because after they didn't return, a search party was sent out, and this party found their tent 1 month later. On February 26th, they found the tent slashed open from the inside. Their boots, coats, and gear were all left behind. It looked like they ran out in absolute terror, wearing only socks or barefoot. Nobody, absolutely nobody, runs into a snowstorm with no clothes on except people running from something horrifying. Next, they started to find their bodies. And get this, the hikers didn't die in one place. They were scattered across the mountain. Doroshenko and Krivonishenko were found near a burned tree, half naked with signs of extreme cold exposure. Their hands were burned as if they had tried to warm up by the fire. One of them bit off a chunk of his own hand. Possible cause of death, hypothermia. Possible cause of terror, something was chasing them. Dyatlov, Slobodin, and Kolmogorova were found frozen mid-crawl trying to get back to the tent, but Slobodin had a cracked skull indicating he probably got hit hard before freezing to death. Then Dubininya, Tabo-Brignoles, Zolotaryov, and Kolevatov were found in a ravine, buried under snow, and their injuries were straight-up horror movie material. Dubininya's tongue was missing, Zolotaryov's ribs were shattered, and Tabo-Brignoles' skull was crushed. Some had radiation on their clothes. How does that even happen? No one really knows what happened that night, but of course there are some pretty spicy theories. First, the Soviet government ruled it an avalanche, but the tent was still standing. No avalanche debris was found, and their injuries weren't consistent with those of an avalanche. Then some say the hikers accidentally wandered into a secret Soviet weapons test because that's the only thing that could explain the radiation on their clothes. Plus, the crushed ribs and skulls could have been shockwaves from possible parachute mine explosions. Honestly, this makes more sense than the friggin' avalanche. Some scientists even came up with some BS about wind patterns creating low-frequency sound that caused panic. Basically, they're saying their brains freaked out, making them run for their lives, but how did they end up with those injuries? Exactly, that still doesn't explain anything. Finally, an official statement was released, and the cause of death was ruled out as compelling natural force, whatever that means. What we know for sure is that something scared 9 expert hikers so badly that they ran into the frozen night and never made it back. Oh, and something really likes tongues. The Girl Scout murders. Rule number 1 of every single camping trip ever: never ever ignore the signs. Unfortunately, this rule was probably created after what happened on June 12th, 1977. Basically, Camp Scott, a Girl Scout camp in Mays County, Oklahoma, was getting ready for its first night of the summer session. 3 young girls, 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, 9-year-old Michelle Goose, and 10-year-old Doris Denise Milner, were super excited for their camping adventure. They did the ghost stories, roasted s'mores, and were bunking together in Tent 8, which was kind of far off from the camp counselor's tent. Now, on this particular night, the weather was rainy and gloomy, but hey, that just made it feel more like an adventure, right? Boy, were they wrong. As darkness fell and the rain poured down, some of the girls started to hear strange noises like moaning and whispers in the woods. One camper even saw a flashlight beam moving through the trees. The counselor also heard odd noises but thought it was just animals. Then, around 1:30 a.m., another camper heard a scream. Now, instead of checking that out, the counselors probably just figured that it was just the wind or some overimaginative kids freaking out over a squirrel. Well, big mistake, because by daybreak, 3 young girls were found lying in a pool of their own blood on a trail leading out of camp. They had been beaten and strangled, and Denise had also been sexually assaulted. Their bodies had been dragged 150 feet from their tent, meaning the killer had spent significant time inside the camp. AKA, someone had walked into a tent full of sleeping Girl Scouts, murdered 3 of them, and then calmly left with their bodies, all while dozens of other campers and counselors were nearby. Once the police arrived, they quickly realized this wasn't a simple crime, but something way bigger. There were bloody footprints inside the tent, a flashlight was found nearby, and even duct tape and rope were left behind, which meant it was a planned attack. During the investigation, the police discovered that exactly 2 months before the murders, counselors found a note inside one of the tents that basically said, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. Which sounds like a pretty big red flag, right? But instead of freaking out and closing the camp, the staff just shrugged it off as a weird prank and went on with business as usual. Honestly, they should probably arrest these counselors at this point if you ask me. After months of investigation, the police actually narrowed it down to one main suspect, a man named Gene Leroy Hart, who was a convicted rapist and burglar and had escaped from prison in 1973. Apparently, he had been hiding out in the woods for 4 years, and the dude was a known predator. In fact, he was in jail for kidnapping and raping 2 pregnant women, so yeah, not a good guy. The fact that he was also a Cherokee man who had lived in the area meant he knew the land well and could easily sneak around unnoticed. A manhunt ensued, and he was eventually arrested and sent to jail, but then died of a heart attack in 1979.